This morning for worship, we are exploring the work of Peter Tewson's Tornado God, American Violent Weather and American Religion. Particularly appropriate given the proliferation of tornadoes recently in the Midwest, not something I had to contend with when I was living in East Tennessee, but I might be getting ahead of myself. I think it's important we understand, one, how these things form, and I might also invite folks to, who knows where you go in this building in the event of a tornado? Downstairs? And where downstairs? That's right. Back there in the windowless bowels of the church. That is the safest place. So not something we need to worry about today, I don't think, but it is important to know while we're exploring the topic of tornadoes. I'm glad to hear that folks know where to go. I'll repeat myself. Perhaps there is a gleam of hope in the physics of a cyclone that all things do come to an end, not for some grim appeal towards the end of things, but simply that which is burdening us, that which is turning around us, that which has its grip on us, will not have its grip forever. Things do change. Things have to change. I think anyone who's ever noticed the weather must understand this. It will not rain forever or shine forever, not on the dynamisms of this planet. But perhaps there is a lesson to be learned as well, of some teaching to be imparted regarding the destructive forces that may emerge in the interplay of accelerating extremes. In this case, of a tornado, a matter of temperature and moisture. But for us, in a culture that feels increasingly polarized, it can feel like all is caught in a turning whirlwind of its own sort. Many folks might know, I consider myself a religious naturalist. That is somebody who seeks to find the religious simply in the world as it is. What lessons can be found in the poetry of nature as revealed by science? And yet there is only so much that science can seem to reveal about these phenomenon, but I might be getting ahead of myself. As my folks were like to quote from the Bible, in the face of calamities of any kind, this too shall pass, right? And so it does. When I was just entering my teenage years, a great thunderstorm tore through the valley. While damage was limited, trees and yards and such, very little at my own house, my mama and papa, it's my paternal grandparents, woke in the night to a thunderous crash when a great old oak tree that had stood for, since that little house was a speakeasy in the 1920s, 80 feet tall, maybe taller. Mind you, I was a child at the time, so size maybe hyperbolized in my brain, but it was a big tree, bigger than most trees you would see in Nebraska, and it fell to the ground. Didn't break in half, the root ball and all, just kind of fell with it. It was situated at the top of a hill, and it's strange that it didn't fall down the hill or one way or the other. Instead, this great behemoth fell into the woodline where it laid for years and slowly decomposed, but in the moment of that collapse, my family, my dad, my aunts, my uncles, of course my mama and papa were out there looking at that giant root ball that was taller than I was, counting their lucky stars and with Providence's name in their mouths. It made sense to me. God's hand was to be found in that probability, tilting the scale. What are the odds? Well, about 1 in 360, right? Just the circle where it could fall. But nonetheless, all was well at Mama and Papa's house, and I have been curious about this idea ever since. Peter Tewson explores this idea in Tornado God. Essentially, what is the religious impulse that is evoked in the face of violent weather, especially tornadoes, which, while short-lived and not always massively destructive, have the potential to be the most destructive storms on the planet? An EF5 tornado surpasses any hurricane, even if it doesn't last for as long, largely because it is far more unpredictable. I have yet to see a tornado for myself. Came close, but not entirely. I'll count my lucky stars for that, thank you very much. The idea of such a thing defies imagining, a cone descending from the heavens to commit mass vandalism on the land before up and dissipating. To be sure, the tornado is it is capable of being the most destructive storm on this planet. It's a symbol of the national imagination, including the religious imagination. And again, while I have not witnessed one on my own, and while Tennessee is largely safe from the worst weather, we do have our own share of troubles, of course, like the aforementioned thunderstorms, flooding, more of this will happen likely, given climate change and the acceleration of extremes between industry and the more than human world. How do we slow things down and control what we can? This is a question that I don't particularly have the best answer for right now. While we have the privilege of modern meteorology, which can certainly help, we can lean on this. Consider what this was like for our ancestors and the original people of this land who contended with such forces. If anyone could be said to contend with a tornado, I believe we contend with the aftermath. We may talk about funnel clouds and pressure systems for the better part of this continent's history. Its human inhabitants could scarcely anticipate, much less accurately explain, the force of the tornado. We are at the mercy of these forces in the moment. Such forces turn the mind towards awe in that oldest sense, a profound, humbling experience, synthesizing wonder and terror into a moment, marveling, frightening, turning us in the turn of the whirlwind towards something larger than ourselves. This sense is occasionally evoked as the numinous. That's your $10 theological word for today. The numinous is a concept by Rudolf Otto, one of the most influential thinkers about religion in the first half of the 20th century, best known for his analysis of the experience in his view that this idea of the numinous underlies all religion. He calls it the numinous, says it has three primary components. They are often designated with a Latin phrase. I guess you're going to get some more $10 theological terms. Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. Getting a Master's of Divinity lets you cast Harry Potter spells, just joking. Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. As mysterium, the numinous is wholly other, entirely different from anything we experience in ordinary life. It evokes a reaction of silence. But the numinous is also a mysterium tremendum. There is a fear evoked in its presence. It has an overwhelming power. Finally, the numinous presents itself as this fascinans, as merciful and gracious. Merciful, gracious, a storm? I reckon it's all a matter of perspective. For example, the cyclone woman of the Shawnee, while destructive, is an honored force for evoking awe while not hurting the community, though hardly reviled for razing the homes and businesses of white colonizers picking at their homelands. The whirlwind woman of the Arikara is very similar, viewed not as a force of evil, but one demanding respect, a force of nature like the thunderbirds in their tradition that both communities share, these beings who bring visions and special insights to those humans deemed worthy, those who are willing to bask in that numinous, that great alterity, that great other, with all of its overwhelming force. In short, the tornado and related phenomenon ignite our awareness of the mystery and may lead many folks to appeal to providence for an explanation. Indeed, our species has done just that for a very, very, very long time. Consider the proliferation of sky and storm gods. Any mythology fans in the house? Anyone name some sky deities, storm gods? Thor. Thor's a good one. Zeus, another good one. Anyone else? Uranus, yes. That is a, yeah, Uranus is also like the sky in general, right? Apollo, god of the sun, poetry. Right, yeah. Lots of deities have been associated with the sky. It's this larger than life thing hanging over our heads. Thor, Zeus, Indra of Hinduism. Frequently, these deities have high roles in their status. I mean, Thor is the direct son of Odin. Zeus is just the daddy of Olympus. Indra is not specifically the chief deity in Hinduism. It's a very, very diverse pantheon of deities, but it's very important in that tradition. Other deities like Raijin, the kami of storms and rain in Shinto, who, while certainly not a sole ruler, is often presented as gleefully destructive in art, is also often surrounded full body by the same halo which marks a being as holy in traditional Buddhist and Shinto artwork. So there is a strong significance to this particular figure as well. There are these and many, 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 many more. The sky, with its tendency to turn a sunny day into a squall, has captured the human imagination for at least as long as we've been writing things down. I did forget a very important storm and sky deity, And this might get me in trouble in some places, but Yahweh historically derives from a Canaanite pantheon sky warrior deity, and over time became enmeshed into a monotheistic tradition, but has its roots in the same sort of archetype as a Thor or a Zeus or an Indra. Fascinating how across cultures we have appealed to the heavens for guidance and especially for mercy, not always working in our favor. The sky remains, in many people's minds, the domain of gods and spirits, and even as we have parted the clouds and uncovered some of the machinery of the sky, we must yet grapple with the turning mystery that so often flies in the face of our attempt to moralize the more than human world. It seems little wonder that we humans, both ancient and modern, would find divinity in such a place as the sky. Indeed, several proposed reconstructions of Indo-European god names predating the Minoan civilization have this quality. Deus Pater, for example, is the reconstructed term for a hypothetical sky father type figure. Yahweh, as I mentioned before, has this quality. And God is also mentioned with wind and storms in the Bible. In the story of Pentecost, God, the Holy Spirit, rushes into the room where the apostles are grieving like a great wind before the tongues of fire descend. God evokes all manner of strange and stormy happenings in the tale of Exodus, the Hebrew people fleeing their oppression in Egypt. Naturally, this is a complex but compelling story that I hope to deliver more on in the future, but to be in the presence of something so alter, so tremendum, must have this humbling power with its simple aesthetic force. The sky and its weather systems have earned a place over our heads and in our imaginations, but one has to consider what kind of God falls out of the apotheosis of the sky and the storm. With the exception of monotheistic religious figures, which typically suppose an omnibenevolent creator, many sky god figures, particularly those associated with storms, Thor, Indra, Rajan, especially Zeus, whose later Roman adaptation as Jupiter or Jove at least somewhat influenced the understanding of the monotheistic God of Christianity. Y'all, they're outright capricious, right? Bringing salvation with one hand, and again, especially with Zeus, ruination in the other. And of course, when people came here to colonize this land, they had their own conclusions on the nature of the tornado. The Protestant imagination ran wild with a newfound twist in Providence's grasp. Protestantism is characterized primarily by its insistence on a direct personal relationship with ultimacy. Indeed, our own tradition of Unitarian Universalism has Protestant roots. First source has historically been that personal experience of transcendent mystery and wonder. And while we are more post-Protestant than not, this idea is part of our institutional DNA and is the bedrock of that ethic of pluralism. Nonetheless, such personal connections impart a sense of personal accountability to the divine. And this sense is absolutely rocked in the face of a storm, for people will inevitably ask, why did my home get blown away or not get blown away? Why did this happen to me? Of course, we might ask ourselves those questions in just about any kind of major loss or strife. We might find ourselves wanting in the face of the mystery. This may characterize how we think about ultimacy or God. It's not my place to tell you what to think about God, y'all. That's not what we do here. But I will encourage you to be with the mystery and to be with the people who are also in the mystery with you. The tornado, like all natural phenomenon, particularly in the Protestant mind, is like a manifestation of divine will, with all the moral weight such events must carry. Such ideas are still with us today and leave us with no clear answers to that age-old problem of theodicy. Oops, that's another $10 theological term. That's the vindication of divine goodwill in the presence of evil, both born of people and what is often called natural evil or natural disasters. These stupefy us and leave us perplexed. Why do these things happen? And again, friends, I don't have an answer for you there. But what I will say is, how do we move through such disasters? We look to our neighbor. As Fred Rogers says, you look to the helpers. And if you don't see any helpers, you be the helpers. Perhaps there isn't providence in storms. Perhaps there is providence in the hands that come to rebuild afterwards. In researching for this sermon, for all as busy as this week has been, I got to do some, did my best. I found it interesting how long people have been trying to predict the weather. In 650 BC, the Babylonians predicted the weather from cloud patterns, as well as astrology. In about 350 BC, Aristotle described weather patterns in his book Meteorologica. Chinese weather prediction lore extends at least as far back as 300 BC, which was around the same time ancient Indian astronomers developed weather prediction methods. There's a synthesis between astronomy, astrology, and meteorology. Basically, what's going on up here? What's happening? The people studying it were the people who managed to find some patterns. However, there is a limit to what we can predict with ancient meteorology and even modern meteorology. Suffice to say, the various modes, we've been at this for a good long while. Meteorology finds itself somewhere between the worlds of sciences and arts. And I'm not saying meteorology isn't a science. It certainly is, but it has a limitation in its predictive ability. Wait a second, you have a reading to do, don't you? Relevant. I'm gonna step aside just for a moment.
Gotta love it. This reading comes from Weather and Religion by Peter Tewson. Is that how you say his name? Okay. The connection is as old as humanity itself. In ancient times, people attributed severe weather to the wrath of storm gods. We see this across the world's religious cultures. Yahweh, the God of Israel, has many of the characteristics of a storm god who uses the weather to vanquish his rivals. The Bible is full of meteorological imagery of divine power. In early modern times, thinkers in the Enlightenment and scientific revolution mocked such beliefs as superstition and predicted they would pass away as humans became more scientifically and theologically sophisticated. But in America, the Enlightenment hubris came face to face with the tornado, the most violent storm on the planet.
That's the part that's relevant. I knew I was missing something. Thank you, Pam. And thank you for your grace and for giving my minister brain, y'all. Connection, not perfection, indeed. This science is complicated by its own complexity, is what I mean to say. You may have heard of an idea called chaos theory. It's a concept derived by mathematician and meteorologist Edward Lorenz. The term butterfly effect in popular media may stem from the real-world implications of the Lorenz attractor, a device he used to display or explain what he meant by chaos theory. Namely, it involves several different initial chaotic conditions that evolve in a way that never repeats. So all chaos is unpredictable, even if it is deterministic. With chaotic systems, their base complexity might be, as I mentioned, deterministic, billiard ball universes. But they remain inherently unpredictable over long periods of time because chaos continually increases in systems. It is impossible to predict the future of a system well. So, for instance, even the small flap of a butterfly's wings could set the world on a vastly different trajectory, such as by causing a hurricane, thus giving rise to the somewhat famous concept of the butterfly effect. You might think about time travel paradoxes and how you step in one wrong place and the whole timeline is different, as stories often go. We can't travel back in time, but we can observe how chaotic systems don't repeat and how slight changes in initial variables can totally change the outcome. Lorenz noted that the butterfly effect is derived from the metaphorical example of the details of a tornado, the exact time of formation, the exact path taken being influenced by minor perturbations such as a distant butterfly flapping its wings several weeks earlier. Fun fact that I spoiled to Tom earlier, Lorenz originally was going to use a seagull in this metaphor to cause a storm, but was persuaded to make it more poetic with the use of a butterfly. I think that was a good idea. He found a very small change in initial conditions had created a significantly different outcome. This was the chief takeaway from chaos theory. Howard Bloomstein, a storm chaser and meteorologist, puts it like this: calculus and physics are our big retention killers, and I hope that y'all who might be visiting don't run away because I'm talking about math. I'm doing my best. There's an inherent unpredictability about tornadoes. You'll never be able to predict that a thunderstorm will appear in this exact location, and then an hour and 20 minutes later will go on to produce a tornado. If you look at the equations, they are highly nonlinear. They are variables multiplied by variables. If you make a small error or are unable to observe a variable beyond a certain threshold of precision, what goes into the equation is not just an error, it's a product. And once you start to create a product, you begin generating what he calls tremendous unknowns. Another word for this nonlinearity is chaos. Lorenz noted in his own observations that one criteria of chaos is a sensitivity to initial conditions. A fluctuation as small as part of a percent can have an outsized impact, and it is this finding that flies so hard in the face of this Enlightenment-era hubris that presupposes an absolutely reducible natural world. Supposing all systems are deterministic is only useful if it allows us to make useful predictions, which it does to a degree, but only to a degree. There is a fundamental limit to our ability to make long-term predictions about just about anything, but especially the weather. No matter how fine you make your measurements, you need to make them finer and finer and finer and finer into a solipsism, a logic hole. Even if the face of the Earth was surrounded and with entirely just all the ground and atmospheric sensors, there would be too much room still to allow for chaotic variables to impact the measurements. So you really cannot, in any meaningful way, predict weather perfectly. There is a crisis then. While meteorologists have accepted this, there is a crisis in contemporary mainstream theology when it comes to this very thing, when it comes to justifying God's goodwill in such a world. Some theologians suppose that our odds are very slim to find any conclusive justification for anything like a traditional notion of divine activity. But others have taken the revelations of a chaotic world and quantum systems as a reason to uphold multiple ways of knowing. Far from throwing out science, the study of such systems ought to grant us some form of epistemic humility in a world defined by complexity, chaos, unpredictability, and that mysterium tremendum of Otto. Now, we often, as much as we talk about capital M mystery as if it is like a placeholder for God, which sometimes in Unitarian churches it is, but in general, Americans abhor that idea. We prefer straightforward black and white answers, just the facts. The tornado is perhaps the height of what we cannot control, cannot contain, either in science, religion, or a disposition like religious naturalism. Animists and pantheists alike still have to grapple with the theodicy problem that's brought by violent weather and tornadoes, and there isn't a particularly satisfying answer. We are just left with the mystery and the turning. Theologians can spin in their chairs all day, but those who have spun with the whirlwind are left changed in that stupefying and awe-evoking experience. The mystery abounds, but perhaps that's nowhere more fervently than in the hearts and souls of survivors. Many people, like my own folks, were standing around a fallen tree which, had the winds been blowing harder or in a different direction, may have flattened their home. No doubt look to the heavens and wonder whether the weather was the result of some divine plan or just meteorological dice. This is a question that I cannot broach, but as for Otto's concept of the numinous, the Phasians, the relief that if divine goodwill is to be found anywhere, as I've said before, it is in these hands, your hands, these hearts, your hearts, those who help rebuild and restore some sense of normalcy. Should such a storm come through again, I'm pretty sure it's gonna, especially as the systems of our climate become increasingly chaotic through the interventions of fossil fuels in the atmosphere and global warming. These are heaping on variables, so it's only going to become more chaotic and more unpredictable. Nonetheless, what do we do when we are in chaotic and unpredictable systems? We band together. This is a hallmark of our species who has endured volcanoes, all kinds of natural disasters in our relatively short time on this planet. But it was together that we persevered and faced them, by leaning into the work. And if you know of agencies who do this kind of restoration work or aid work, I would be happy to talk with you, friends. This is how Unitarian Universalists do, though. We don't wait for an appeal from the sky. We look to our neighbors. We look to ourselves, the intersection between individuals and community, and find the good there and make it real and realized in the world. That is holy work. Like Sophia Lyons-Foss says, life becomes religious when we make it so. Let us make it so. In our age-old contemplations of the sky and its tendencies to open into havoc, it's little wonder that the human animal would be so quick to offer supplication to the sky. Of course, we ought to hopefully understand that the storm is a force beyond appeal. It does not care, which is perhaps what is most tantalizing and terrifying about a study of nature, because we care tremendously. We may feel a moral injury in the wake of devastations, and that's okay. Towns and people blown away while others remain to speculate on the why. This is that numinous quality, the untamable, the unnameable, for even if we do not believe in any particular God, all beings, in some way or another, bow to the storm, not in worship, but in reverence, and particularly the tornado, the weather phenomenon so particular to North America, especially here in the Midwest. May the love that is required to respond to such catastrophes be what is particular about this church and about you. Amen. Blessed be, friends.